When I was in junior high school, I built a model home in the 8th grade under the direction of Mr. George Homer, my woodshop teacher, and I won the citywide competition with him. Okay. And we just had a lot of guidance in, and that's what our children today are lacking. They're lacking role models and leadership. And more people should get involved with our young people at an early age, in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, to guide them in the right direction. Because everybody can teach someone or someone else something. Okay? We need more positive role models and more involvement, especially from the males in our community. And we need to stop telling our young people how bad they are and start telling them the good points that they have. We need to reinforce the good points and motivate them to become better citizens. And if we can do that, we will notice a drastic change in our young people when they get to be teenagers. But we can't wait until they're teenagers to try and shape them. We need to start at an early age, like all of the role models I had started. They were role models for us when we were 4th, 5th, 6th. And they were right in there with us, leading us and guiding us along the right path. And like I said previously, you almost had to be successful because of the men of character that we had around us. And that's what we need to do for our young people.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. In researching the history of Tulsa, one of the most interesting personalities that I discovered was A.D. Davis, Tulsa's first black foot patrol policeman. In fact, there were lots of other black policemen shown in this picture that we're looking at right now, which we'll show a close-up later, including, in addition to the foot patrols, there were motorcycle policemen. And these are things that are not known about early Tulsa, but it existed as early as the late 1920s, and we know this photo has been dated at least between 1929 and no later than 1933. So there were black policemen. They're all shown on the extreme right side of this picture. Even on the picture, they're segregated. They're on the right side of this photograph. And we're interviewing today Leon Davis, who's the son of A.D. Davis, this early black policeman. His father was a very colorful character. At age 69, he married and started a new family, 4 sons, one of whom was Leon, who we are interviewing this day. Tell us about this colorful man and all the things you found in history. Leon is also writing a book, and we'll have him tell us a little bit about his book and the things he's discovered about Tulsa's early history.
The most interesting thing I think I found about the history of black Tulsa is the fact that there was a lot of participation of blacks in cultural and a lot of academic, and plus there were a lot of businessmen because majority of the blacks here were out of the colleges in Mississippi, and they came here because the whites would give this particular spot all kinds of different nicknames, like the oil capital of the world, the magic empire, just green country, the cleanest city in the world, just on and on and on. Well, a lot of people gave Tulsa a lot of these names, and plus the most interesting thing I found out is about the name Tulsa. Uh, the way they portray the name Tulsa and Tulsa is because, and T-Town, was because when the outlaws would come down to the sacred Indian hunting and burial ground, uh, according to who they were talking to, is what the name of the town was. You have to remember back then it wasn't any birth certificates, it wasn't any official documents, anything that would say that the name was concrete until statehood in 1907. And the official name, most popular name, was Tulsa. And then the next popular name was T-Town. And how the name derived, how all that came down to T-Town was according to who you were talking to. If you talked to the white man that was in the territory, basically illegally, he called it Tulsa. You talk to the blacks, they call it Tulsa or Tush Hall. If you talk to the Indians, they call it Tallahassee, which in Creek meant our gathering place. So the outlaws were always mixed up about the name of the spot. So, but everything started with a T, so they started naming it T-Town. And that was the beginning of Tulsa, Oklahoma, after the railroad came out of Kansas and down into the Oklahoma territory. That's when everything was, how did it copyright? You had to copyright to get the name of the town.
Okay, tell us about your dad and law enforcement and that rough house, the motorcycle.
Okay, I always heard my dad, either my family, my mother, and friends, and most of the people that I knew were much older than me, and they would always talk about this colorful guy, Rough House, which later on in years I met his son, which his name was Herbert McGall, and most people knew him in these times as Rough House too, and he was the first black motorcycle patrolman. And what he would do, he was noted for going down Greenwood and giving a ticket was standing on the side of the person with one leg rested on the people's running board on their T-Mall Fords, and would give them a ticket without stopping. The motorcycle squad, as I read in my history, was started because the city was chasing down the bootleggers, which were cab drivers, and they couldn't catch him on foot, so they put out a motorcycle patrol, and the rest of them would walk the beat, which you have to understand at this particular time when Tulsa was started, it was only about a 1 mile area strip, and that strip grew as time grew on, which right now you would say the strip now is probably I'd say 7 miles. Back then it was just a mile. Okay, I was about 10 years old when my father died, and I had 3 brothers older than me, which all 3 of them are very successful in life. My oldest brother, A.D. Davis Jr., he is a retired full bird colonel out of Air Force, and M.V. Davis, an employee of American Airlines, and Ernest Davis, my 3rd brother, he is an educator and he's a teacher, and he works with different government programs and everything like that. And me, myself, I just consider myself as a freelance businessman. I do this, do that, whatever. That's the reason they always tell me that I'm something similar like it. But I always remembered my father as one of the biggest businessmen I ever known, because in the black community, he was over all the election polls that was on the north side, and whites would come and recruit him to get people to work in their campaigns for their political gains. Also, he stayed on the police force, which I checked with the library, from 1929 to 33. And after he left the police force, he started a business, in the old Greyhound bus station, which was on 4th and Cincinnati, and we had one of the largest shoe shine stands in town, and which we kept for around about 33 years. And he was quite some businessman. He had realm property, which a lot of people around town that stayed with us over a period of years, and even after his death, he had provided us a place to make our living without, getting any assistance or anything of that sort. And plus, all of us went off to school and got an education and stuff like that. Now, my mother, which my father died in '55, and my mother, she just died in 1994, which she was 87 years old. And she was the daughter of Tamar Franklin, which she was a Black Creek freedman. And she gave, down in Haskell County, she gave the land for the first schoolhouse to be built for blacks. And also, she had 40 of her 160 acres that she had was overflowing with oil, which we're currently investigating it. And but at that particular time, she had died before the discovery of oil, and it was some kind of way that they were beat for the oil or something happened, whatever. There was no compensation in it. But I'm quite sure that the case will still be open. All it had to do is be pursued. And we have been having here lately, in the last 4 or 5 years, Black Creek Freedmen meeting. And Scott McIntosh is the chief, and I'm the chief spokesman for the Black Creek Freedmen. And it has been very interesting to find the history of Black Tulsa. And another notable thing that really caught my eye, even about this, my family, but that I learned through my family, was the fact that this word Black Wall Street. And I often wondered what Black Wall Street meant, and then when I investigated, I came to the conclusion that the Black Wall Street thing was a part where you had, this was the only place in the United States where blacks own land and buildings and control organized crime in a white community. And this was a part of what led up to the riots of 1921, because they had a bunch of successful blacks here that were making money because of segregation. They had a full audience just to themselves, and I call it the money machine. And the money machine clicked for about 60 or 70 years. And it had things of the Greenwood Chamber of Commerce in the 30s. It had guys coming in, which Williams, I can't think of Williams' first name, but he was the first entrepreneur. He came from Mississippi, and he was a diesel mechanic, and they hired him to power up the ice cream factory that they had here. And plus, he was right now where the present spot of the Oklahoma Eagle is. That was his mechanic shop, and he was the first black to, I think, own a vehicle. And then the springboard went from there. But now, how most of the people, the blacks, got rich in those days, all was wealthy, or whatever you want, however you want to put it, was that the white man, he was so in haste, which there's rumors that it was a secret society, which was the Ku Klux Klans, and they came out of Kansas, and they worked for the railroad, and they were mapping out land, and they wanted this particular spot, which was a sacred Indian hunting and burial ground. And the reason that they wanted it was because that it was in the middle of the Indian Nation, and it was going to make it the bordering capital of the world, of the Indian Nation. And which in turn, they turned scandalous, and they turned into crooks. And what they did was, they started duping other white businessmen by telling them that it was a get-rich scheme. You could get into something for a little or nothing, but under the table, it was known as the town with little or no money because this was a bordering territory. They've told myths about slavery and stuff in the territory, which was, my fact, my research was a lie because there wasn't any money. And the reason that the spot here was so famous too was that the railroad only ran to Kansas and the cow barons was in Texas. And they had to cross the trails here to get to the railroad, but by it being a bordering territory, as they call it, the lower creeks, which was the half-breed blacks, and the creeks was the beginning of toll roads, and they would ask for a tariff for crossing their borders, and if you didn't give it to them, they'd hang you, either take half of whatever you had. And they were jealous about that because if they tried to carry their goods any other way, it would cost them too much money, too much time, and all this kind of stuff like that. So that's what made it it's a very strategic spot. Now, I haven't really got down to measurements, but I have been told that this spot was 103 miles east of where the land run began. It was also in the middle of the Indian Nation, and 100 miles, which I'm not for sure right now, a lot of people say Joplin, Missouri, is the center of the United States. So it's a pretty strategic location. And also it was, as I said before, sacred Indian hunting burial ground, and the people here, a lot of them didn't want it because there was no water. All you had here was spring water, which on the growth of population, they swallowed it up right quick. You couldn't drink the Arkansas water because it was too dirty, but it had 50-pound catfish and stuff like that in it like that. And basically, it was a man-made town. Old Wassa, Broken Arrow, all these places that surround it, Sand Springs, Sapulpa, everything around it was older than Tulsa. But Tulsa grew to be the second largest town in Oklahoma, and at this particular time it's still growing because of the boosters and everything, which now you call the Chamber of Commerce, and which it was two tails in the city because you have a black Chamber of Commerce, you got a white Chamber of Commerce, you still have a certain mixture of black Tulsa and white Tulsa and stuff like that.
We have heard an interesting bit of history today about A.C. Davis and A.D. Davis and the early days of the blacks in the police force, and kind of an update on Tulsa's history right up to the present. There will be a book in the future. Leon Davis is writing a book. It's entitled, has a very colorful title, Corn Whiskey, Gambling, Chalk Beer, Crack Cocaine in Black Wall Street, 1836 to 1994, A True Story, T-Town. And he not only covers this history that we all know so well, but also heretofore untold stories about the underground culture and the nature of the underground and illegal things. So we look forward to Mr. Davis's book also.
You ready?
Go ahead.
Okay. A little history that I found out about the black policeman. There was a lot of discrimination in the police force from the beginning of the start of the police force for its black officers. After the riots of 1921, there was a crackdown on black police officers because they were saying that they were allowing the chock houses and the whiskey cooking and everything else to go on, and they wanted a crackdown of the white policemen, which have reigned from then until now. Plus, the only difference between the police force then and now, which was back then for black, was prestigious, and right now I guess we would say it's prestigious too, because it's a very good lucrative job. But there have been a lot of complaints about, you know, police being fired. There's not many that retire. You have ongoing situations now where there's always, when the media, when you hear something, it's predominantly a black policeman, if even for standing up for his rights or saying anything like that. And my father, A.D. Davis, as records show, from 1929 to 1933, as I could gather it from which I'm go more depth into it, was kind of like a political appointment to be a policeman, a black policeman, and it was a good job. They didn't have any benefits, anything in it. But he made a lot of friends and everything, and I guess he was a well-known, respected man, because some of the older sets, you know, they tell me, yeah, I remember your father, I, you know, did this, and he always carried as I know him, a little briefcase, and he always smoked a big cigar, and a lot of people would call him Cigar. And he was a pretty stable man, because as I was coming up, and I will be 50 this year, I've only stayed in 2 houses in my life. So that proved that undoubtedly he must have been a pretty stable man, and he was a good man. And one of my brothers had a service revolver, which I think back then it was a 44, not a 45, it was a 44. And he had a field Winchester, which one of my cousins right now, he's a gunsmith, and he's supposed to rebuilding it and everything like that. But he was a very outstanding man. I'd probably have more information on him when I go in depth in it, but through the death of my mother this year, and this month particularly that I'm talking in now, I haven't had a chance to research, but in my book I will have.
Anyone who's doing anything about the history of Tulsa will inevitably be recommended to see Juanita Lewis Hopkins. This woman knows more history than perhaps anyone in Tulsa, and she's not a historian, she's an English teacher, a retired English teacher who has taught over 6,000 children in Tulsa and has won numerous awards for her abilities. But it is as a historian that, an amateur historian, that she is most noted for by the elderly Tulsans. And today she's going to share with us something about Greenwood in its heyday, about the movement when blacks started to demand full participation in Tulsa society, Tulsa that was known as the most segregated city in America. She participated in some civil rights protests, and she's going to tell us about that, and just some other very interesting things about Tulsa and about its legacy of jazz. And one of her own brothers was a prominent jazz musician who played with Dizzy Gillespie, Lucky Millinder, Charlie Yardbird Parker. She just has a wealth of information about every aspect of Tulsa life. So Mrs. Juanita Lewis Hopkins, thank you for sharing this with us. And tell us some things about Tulsa.
I'm happy that I can share this with you. First of all, I have spent all of my 71 years in Tulsa. I was born here, and to me, Tulsa has represented, as Charles Dickens said, a tale of two cities, because we have definitely had a North Tulsa and a South Tulsa. In recent years, we've tried to combine them and merge them together. But it has been a very, very, shall I say, phenomenal city. I remember very early going shopping with my mother and being told that we could not use bathrooms, we could not get anything to eat, and having to walk approximately 25 blocks before we could get to a place where we could use bathroom facilities. But it has been an interesting history, because I have seen it, I think, go through a number of stages. From the time when checks for Afro-American teachers were one color and checks for Caucasian teachers were another color. but we finally have overcome some of that at least. Greenwood on Thursday nights and on Saturdays and Sundays was like a beehive. It was just bustling. You almost had to keep your arms at your side to even walk down the street. And it was quite lively, quite colorful, very interesting. The people who worked in service were off on Thursday afternoons and on Sundays mostly. So they dressed in their finest, and they visited the drugstores in the area, and incidentally we had about 10. And all of them were doing very good business. One owner, Dr. William H. Kyle, had 3 drugstores. One was in the 100 block on North Greenwood, one was in the 1000 block on Greenwood, and the other was in the 1300 block on North Lansing. We had a number of mortuaries, and they all did good business. At that time, the ambulances would respond to emergencies, and the youngsters would stream down the streets after them, and it was always just something always going on. There were at one time 10 hotels in North Tulsa, and these were not run-down places. These were neat, clean places. Most of the musicians who came to Tulsa stayed at the Smalls Hotel, but Smalls was only one. It was in the center on Archer. The rest of them were located from Archer back to Pine Street and down Lansing, so we had a number of hotels where people could stay. One interesting thing was the growth of the medical community. At one time, of course, we could not be fully admitted as patients at most of the hospitals. My father had a brother who died in the basement of a hospital, and because he was Afro-American, and he could not be admitted to a room. There were surgeons, black surgeons, who performed surgery at all odd hours because they were not on the staff, they were not approved. But one particular surgeon was known throughout the United States, and people were flown in here for him to do brain surgery on him. He had a brother who was a pharmacist here, and another brother in Topeka, Kansas, who was a mortician. But this particular surgeon, Dr. E.E. Bowser, was known throughout the United States for his medical ability. The educational system in Tulsa has changed a great deal. When I graduated from Washington in 1940, we had 2 jazz bands at the high school. We had a symphony orchestra. We had a small string chorale. These were in additions to the marching band. Most of the musicians who left Tulsa had been taught music only in high school. And we had people like Earl Bostic, we had Roy Milton, we had the 2 Rogers brothers, Johnny and L.D. And we had a number of young people who went on to other cities to become outstanding musicians. Harold Singer, who lives in Paris now and who's made a number of albums, is from Tulsa, is a local Tulsan. And it's sad that somehow we have lost the fine arts that we had. And we have lost a lot of things, I feel, in the field of education. But we're struggling to come back.
Carver Middle School, how you all took over.
Okay, Carver was closed, and it was closed, they said, because of inability to work with the youngsters. A group of local people, patrons, led by Julius Pegues, sat down one evening and decided that we were going to try to get the school reopened. It was in the heart of the community, and without a school, a community dies, because most services are geared around the educational facility that you have. Julius, along with Pastor Dahlman, Catherine Stearns, Mabel Littles, and a number of others, went to jail for the protesting of the closing of the school. We operated a freedom school in the facilities of St. Monica Catholic Church for 1 full semester. The church assumed the insurance, all of the cost of the building, and we were able to convince the Board of Education that a school was necessary in this area. And so Carver was reopened. We went through a lot. We picketed churches, we picketed Safeway, we picketed the Educational Service Center, and we finally got the attention of some people. But the plan that was drawn up for Carver and for Washington were drawn up by Julius Pegues.
One final event Mrs. Hopkins is going to share with us is what happened to her own mother during the Tulsa race riot of 1921. And her mother was a good friend of Opal Long Dargan. And Mrs. Hopkins, will tell us about that day, what your mother did that day.
Okay, as my mother had recalled to me many times, as the men were setting fires to the house in the block in which she lived, the 500 block on Latimer Street, she and a sister-in-law went behind them, putting out the fires. As fast as they would light them, they would douse them with water. And Mrs. Dargan, Opal Dargan's mother, Mrs. Long, was along there when they left to take their children to a safe place. My brother at that time was around 6 months old, and it was quite an eventful thing, as she recounted. She had come to Tulsa in 1917 and had lived in various areas in the town, and of course they had settled on the property on Latimer Street, and from there they became active members of the community.
Where was your dad at this time?
My dad was being taken with other men to the convention hall. That was the center where they had taken them. And some of them were taken to Mohawk Park. But it was, as she recalled it to me, it was 2 years before I was born, but it was quite a thing.
Thank you so much for sharing this Tulsa history with us.
You're
today.
very welcome. This is a portrait of my mother, Lillian Alexander. It was painted when she was 18 years of age by a physician for whom she worked in his home at that time. She came to Tulsa along with my father in 1917, and they eventually settled at 537 East Latimer Street. She worked with her church very actively, and my mother died when she was 94, and she was very alert, had an excellent memory, and was just a delightful person. Very small in stature. She was very brave and and brusque, but she was, that's her. That's my mom. This is a picture of my dad, C.J. Alexander Sr. He thinks that he was born in Kansas. He really was not sure of that. He was one of the early black policemen in the city of Tulsa, and he also operated a barbecue stand at 1111 North Greenwood. It was known as Brother Alex and Sons, and he was known for his ability to cook barbecue. So my father was a deacon at First Baptist Church, North Tulsa, and where he had been a member for a number of years. But he was a very outgoing person, and never turned away anybody hungry. He fed everybody who came by who was hungry. He would just tell them not to pack and tote. If you've got a family, go get your family, bring them down here, and let them eat. But to me, he was one of my role models. My father was one of the pioneers in the barbecue business. The earliest person that I remember was Uncle Steve. He was on the corner of Jasper and Greenwood. And then came my father. And then later on through the years, you had Latimers, and you had Emersons, you had Pat Whites. So that was a chain of barbecue stands.
There have always been individuals who could not accept the inequity of racism in the United States. They could not accept that this democracy that looks so great on paper would deny rights to some of its citizens simply because of their skin color or hair texture. One such person was Reverend Benjamin S. Roberts, who was born in Georgia, who grew up in the Deep South, who was a very religious person, who was also a community activist, and He moved to Tulsa in 1949 and worked with the Tulsa NAACP, and it was he who was responsible for leading Tulsa on sit-ins and on other acts of protest that eventually helped this city to dismantle segregation. Today we're going to hear from Reverend Roberts himself about the Civil Rights Movement, about Martin Luther King Jr. and his vision, and all of this and how it helped to make America more democratic and a more spiritual nation. Reverend Roberts, tell us about those days, about meeting. When did you first meet Martin Luther King, and how did you get all this civil rights activism going?
I met Martin Luther King in Atlanta, Georgia around 1944. He was at Morehouse College at that time, and I was at ITC, which was Morris Brown at that time, getting my bachelor's degree in the seminary. My background, I think the reason I'm in Tulsa, I had problems with what I saw as a young fellow. I had deep problems. I grew up in the Deep South where black people was just physically slaves. And I could see white person moving. I give you an example, one of the things that just bothered me. That's just one of the hundreds of things. Cold days, we walking on ice, going to school, we had to walk about a mile. And white kids were riding on a bus at that time. And then they made faces at us and this type of thing. And I just resented that type of thing because I knew I was a person. And I saw persons treated in the Deep South inhuman, almost worse than a slave. And it built up something within me to the extent, and well, I did not say that, but to the extent that I always felt that if I ever have a chance, I was going to do something about what had happened in my life and the life of so many black persons that I saw humiliated, killed without any reason. And coming up to Atlanta, we found things a little bit better, but police department was not what it should have been. And when I came to Tulsa in 1949, I found that racism in Tulsa was as bad or worse than it was in Georgia. The only thing that was in my favor was you had a police department that did not just abuse black people. Police departments were a little bit more, I said, cultivated than Big Wolf, of which I came. And we could talk to them. Where I came from, we couldn't even tell the police we were not guilty. So that gave me some insight on what could be done in Tulsa to break down discrimination. As I said, discrimination was just, in Tulsa, just about as bad, but it was more or less a psychological thing, brainwashing people. It wasn't slave type, but to me it was just as bad or worse because we had a lot of persons just, when I said black people, just brainwashed into a system with the power structure doing a few things for a few people, and the masses of the people were somewhat enslaved. As a civil rights person, I think what brought me to this, we had our late Ben Hill and I had a lot of activities with young people together. We both had been former school teachers and principals of school, and we found that there was a need for someone to co-rest some of our black kids that was out in the streets. So we started within our church, and we would have what we call Christian education workshops and at one of the parks with the two churches coming together. And one year, must have been around 92, we had this type of unity. And when we completed, we was going to take the kids out on a good picnic. Where are we going? And they played around and mentioned several places. And finally someone said, why can't we go to Mohawk? I said, fine, we can go to Mohawk. So we chartered about 3 or 4 city buses that morning and carried our kids to Mohawk Park. And the kids, well, was going to the zoo, and then the park is outside the zoo there, so the kids wanted to go in the zoo. They went in the zoo and stayed a couple of hours. And when they got tired of the zoo, they came out and began to play in the park. Well, after they was in the park, I said about an hour, a policeman came up and asked who was we, and we told him who we were. And to make a long story short, he said, well, did you know you cannot bring no folks here? And I asked him a question. I said, aren't we taxpayers in this park supported by the taxpayers? He said, yes. I said, aren't we taxpayers? Don't we have a right for our kids to participate in this facility? He said, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'm just told you cannot use the facility. And I'm going to ask you to please leave. It was the late being here, myself, and 2 or 3 ladies. I said, well, okay, so I guess we just sort of hurriedly communicated with them and said, okay, well, let's call the buses and let's go. That was about, we had called to ask the buses to pick us up around 4 o'clock, but that was around 1 o'clock, 1 or 2, something like that. So we just called out and told the buses to come get our kids, which they did. We came home and we began to write up what we saw and what happened. Then here was an expert writer. He began to put it in the Oklahoma Eagle, and we began to put articles in the paper as to how we was approached, what happened, and we defied the entire community for letting this happen to kids of African descent. Well, we was called and they were saying, they said that we was exciting a ride, and the black leadership called us wetbacks, which we didn't know. We had a lot of fun out of that because we didn't know what wetbacks meant. We went and looked it up, and we found out that it was someone is in a place that has no business there or something like that. So we laughed it off, but after that, they began to call us and tell us that we don't want no trouble. We said we don't want no trouble, we just want to play for our kids just like any other kids. And we did that for several months. And the next year, when we had the same type of entity, we asked her where we going on our picnic. It was Sandy Hill, and never forget, she said, we go to Mohawk. I said, well, you know what happened last year? She said, well, we go to Mohawk. She knew, you know, we had stirred up everything. So we went to Mohawk. We didn't go in the zoo that time. Some of the kids probably did, but we didn't go in the zoo. We let them take advantage of the facilities of the park. About noon, I guess, this fella came up, and one fella said, oh, have your police there? There he come again. So I stepped to the front, and he said, well, y'all are back again. He said, yeah, we're back again. Our children are having a little fun. We've been working hard for the last 10 or 15 days. He said, well, okay. He looked at us all over. He said, okay, just enjoy the facilities, keep it clean. That's what he said to us, and we stayed there until we got ready to leave. Now that's how Mohawk Park became integrated. One of the things we found about Tulsa, if you uncover that dirt, they didn't want anyone outside to know what they were doing, so they just got together with the city officials, and they said they were going to open the park, and it was open that easily. I was the president at that time of the Ministerial Fellowship. Ministerial Fellowship consists of Methodist ministers and other ministers that didn't. The Baptists had an organization called the Baptist Alliance. So we invited any minister that was not AME to join our fellowship, so we call it Ministerial Fellowship. The news came to us that the buses was segregated. That was before the instance in Montgomery, Alabama. So we had some negotiation with the heads of the bus department. So finally, a couple of us went out and talked to the man that was in control, the manager of the transit system. And when we gave him the story as to how people being humiliated, working all day, having to stand up on the bus, even if that was a seat from the back to the front, if white person got on and passed the front and black was sitting anywhere there, they would ask the black to stand. So after we talked to him at length, he said this to us. He said, well, I'm from New York, by the way, of California. It doesn't make a so and so where they sit. So we went home and just wrote a letter to all the ministers and had them to know we had a conference and what the decision was, and tell your people that are working cross town and need facilities with the bus to get on and sit where they can sit and don't get up. Well, I think we got one report where that next week we got one report where one of the bus drivers threatened a person that was riding the bus. And she said, well, we got a letter from our pastor. We got information from our pastor Sunday stating that he had gotten a letter from the transit department telling us to sit anywhere that there's a vacancy in this seat is vacant. So that's all into that. That's how the transit system in Tulsa got integrated. Well, it came to the tough thing, and I became the director in the council for the youth division of the NAACP. Having worked with a lot of young people, I understand that they had said that we could not get a youth council. The NAACP in Tulsa was pretty strong at that time, but they didn't have a youth division. So I made the announcement, and I got late Reverend Hill to help me to announce it, that we was going to organize a youth council. And we set the date for them to meet. We met at St. John Church, and we had something like 75 young people to assemble. And we organized. We had Reverend McCutcheon still here. He worked with the Reverend Carl Thiele, was the pastor of Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, who worked diligently with us. And Father O'Neill was the pastor of the Catholic Church. And those were the adults that worked with us. So we met and set up our plans as to what action we was going to take. We knew that at this time, the boycott in Alabama was moving, and Martin Luther King was stirring up a whole lot in Alabama. And we knew then that we had a great task to do here in the city of Tulsa. But while we were getting our young people together, we named several things that we could do. So one summer, this summer, first summer, we talked about the apathy and voted in Tulsa. We asked young people, will you help us in a voters registration campaign? Or they were just willing to do most anything. So we pulled together and got cards and information, and we got to the election board and got the precinct layout. And we sent our kids to knock on doors, fill out information, getting statistics as to who is registered here and who not. So we found out that we only had a few thousand people registered in Tulsa, and hundreds were not registered. They'd come back to the church, and we had 3 or 4 ladies to give them a good meal, and the kids enjoyed a good night, warm meal. So they worked beautifully. In a few weeks, they had almost accomplished a goal. I went down to the election board and asked for them to let us have what you call person that could register kids. And they said they had persons out here several times, but they got no success. And they sort of was delirious about it. So I had them know, we got thousands of persons ready to vote. Say, if I send a register, that's what I'm trying. If I send a register out there, do you think you can get me 25 or 30 persons to register? I said, if you send me a couple of registers, I can guarantee you we'll have 1,000 persons registered pretty soon. So they sent us out a couple, and things ran over. We had persons on the telephone. We put 4 or 5 telephones in a little building we had rented on Pine and Madison. And we put 7 telephones when the 2 or 3 organizations began to give us some money. A. Philip Randolph, person out of Washington named Cope. And we rented this building and put 2 or 3 telephones in it, and persons were calling these numbers where we had gathered this information. And we had transportation to pick them up, and so it wasn't long before we had 5 or 6 registered in that little building, and people lined up all around. We registered 10,000 people. To be correct, the figure that we pulled together was 9,997 people that we registered during this campaign. Because I remember making a statement, I said, if I had known that, we would have gotten 3 more persons, 1,000. But through that, and then we attempted through them to have a follow-up with voting, which we continued to operate that area there. But finally, when your money's gone, you don't have any way to continue, but we had very good success for a while in having good turnout for voting. Now the hard task comes. How are we going to integrate these public facilities? We discussed this with our kids. They were ready to go because the news now, you know, at Little Rock is sprouting, Oklahoma City, Alabama. So what are we going to do? Are y'all willing? Can you take the rap? I don't know if I should put this on the news, but we got some inside person to come and help us to set up, tell us how we could demonstrate without being, well, we might be arrested, but without being charged with a penalty. So we had our kids well trained as to how they could do it. We were going to pick it, how they could pick it without breaking the law. And I guess as we were about ready, well, we was in the midst of testing, so we set up a testing program. And at that time, we had about 50 or 60 white kids from Tulsa University wanted to join our movement. We told them, yes, if they could stand the heat, come on. And you'd be surprised to know Roger Ramos was one of those persons. He was a student at TU at that time. So he came on and worked with us very diligently in the testing program. We had them to go and test these public facilities. We sent a white person and a black person together. And the amusing thing was when the proprietors come out and see, you would ask them, can we come in or want a sandwich or whatever they served in this institution or place. The proprietor would say, no, you can come in, but you can't. The white person come in, but the black could. Well, this was the first time. So what the white person said, well, I'm not coming in if she or he doesn't come in. Well, neither one of us come in. So this is the first time white kids had ever seen what discrimination and embarrassment is. So they came back, they wanted to go right then the next day and start direct action. Well, the next thing we did, we came up with the March on Washington. I asked them on Saturday, I said, do y'all want to go to the March on Washington? Oh yeah, all of them said, well, okay, you don't carry a load. So I went to the senior branch of the NAACP and told them what we was going to do, and told them we needed a few $1,000 and wanted them to help us. And Lake Ben Hill was the president then of the NAACP. So we put on these big programs, and I have to give them credit. They did support the kids beautifully at that point. We raised enough money to charter a bus to carry 41 persons to the March on Washington. We carried 41 young persons to the March on Washington. And that was one of the most credible, most fantastic experiments that kids had ever seen. We got in there about 7 o'clock that morning. We stopped on the suburb of Washington and got a couple of hotel rooms for the kids to, you know, change up, take a bath if they want to. So we got to the scenery about 7, 8 o'clock, and nothing was there much. People setting up tables and setting up a few lights. You know, about 9 o'clock, people began to come from everywhere. 10 o'clock, people began to come from everywhere. And about 11 o'clock, I can guarantee it was a couple 100,000 people there at that point. Now this is where Martin Luther King got his national fame. He was in Alabama the leader of the movement in Alabama, but they had several persons to speak. Even A. Randolph himself, one of the sponsors of the March on Washington. But when Martin Luther King spoke from that scene, I have a dream. He took this whole country, not except for the most part, the world. That way he gained that national fame. And being a young orator, young scholar, he was able to shake this whole country. We said that with all the other areas that was not doing the same thing they was doing, it made it possible for us to have a real revolution in America. Sometime shortly after the March on Washington, that I just being a homeboy, and at that time we could we couldn't get the ministers to march with us, but I just said the Reverend Pegues was very innovative, being, Baptist minister. He helped us to get Martin here. And we was able to get Martin Luther King to come to Tulsa because we began to get national attention. One of the first things, what's happening? Well, we have these problems, and they began to check and found out that Tulsa was getting, well, Oklahoma, I put it that way, was getting national attention, and he responded and came out. The same thing happened where Dick Gregory was concerned. We had called his office and called several times, and I forget the name of the school teacher that was helping us to get Dick here. We met in the 90s, and we didn't get any response, so we finally got into him, and he said that I've been checking on what y'all are doing in Tulsa, and that must have been on a Thursday or Friday. I've been checking on what y'all are doing in Tulsa. Y'all got things going. I'll be in there Saturday at 1 o'clock. We didn't have much time, so we got together and worked all night putting together a way for a program for him to come in here. And we used to theater down on Brady Street. And you would be surprised to know from, well, we had one day to make preparation to put on the air that Pick was coming in, and he was going to speak on Saturday night. And we had that place pretty well full. When Dick Gregory came here, and you know how he was really a civil rights, he was a comedian, and he took his comedian ability, and he just fascinated people, both white and black, that he helped Dick Gregory. Martin Luther King spoke at the First Baptist Church, and he had an opportunity to tell his experience in Alabama, his experiences of being arrested, because he'll be sure about getting some of our ministers to say that they would go to jail, but he was saying how many times he's been arrested and how many times he's thrown the water on him, and all of these things that open eyes a whole lot to people, I say, in this community. So that takes care of that. Let me say one thing maybe about the first demonstration we had. We had a rally, and we had a march. It was the day after Easter because the kids were out of school. We had a parade downtown, down in the park, down on Boulder. And we had this big mass parade, and we had a program there covering several things that we wanted to see Tulsa do. As a result of that, several of the kids left out. Most of these public places locked their buildings on the inside, but about 50 kids went out on 36th Street and all went through the kitchen and got in Borden cafeteria. So we got about 50 arrested. And it was sort of amusing. They got arrested when the judge had them into her chamber, the lady judge, and all of them was juvenile. And she talked to us about what we should be doing with these kids. And she looked around with a question. I never forget. She said, "Now I can't understand you. Your wife is the police person that arrests these children, and here you out here putting them in jail." That was what she said to him. It sort of struck him a little bit. But she said to her, "If I let these kids go, are you going to take them home?" We had 2 or 3 church buses or whatever on Boulder. "Are you going to take them home?" And I just said to her, I said, "Yes, we're going to take them home. These kids got to have something to eat. They've been out all day. As soon as we get something to eat, we're going to take them home." Well, that did something to her fantasy. So she did let them out, and that was the first instance of arrest in Tulsa, which we had several. We had sometime in 1 week, maybe 500 or 600 being arrested. But though we never had an incident during the arrest. We put together a public accommodation bill, and we got it passed by Pickett in City Hall for several weeks. And then we got a public accommodation bill through where it opened the way for a person to live in the city that they felt that they could afford to live. And I never forget when we was talking about a public accommodation, a young lawyer from Tulsa University came out and said he'd have to draw it up so that it would be feasible. So we always had somebody come in and give us support, but it was just needed. So I said it was a movement that was just wonderful, and the Lord was in it all the way, because we never had any type of embarrassment in the program. He wanted to know what we were going to do after we had the testing program. I said, well, we're going to have these places open, these places that where they said no, or they're going to have to close them. We're going to have to open them to all people and close them to no people. He's the police chief. He said to me that if you put these kids in the street, we're going to have every one of them arrested. I said, Mr. Gary said, I got a problem, Mr. Dash. I said, that's your job. But I tell you one thing, instead of you talking to me, you need to be talking to your police department. Because I know you have some policemen that mistreat black, mistreat youth. I said, if these policemen arrest these kids and start to beat them and mistreat them, I said, you've never seen a ride in your life like you don't have in Tulsa. That's the first time we ever mentioned a ride that frightened them. I said, you've never seen a ride like you will see if that happens. Out of all of the kids that was arrested, and I have to give him credit, he's dead, I have to give him credit, there was never a uniformed policeman came to the scene. Plainclothes policemen always came to where they called them disturbance where the kids were sitting in. Another question.
Reverend B.S. Roberts was one of the 18 plaintiffs that the NAACP versus City of Tulsa lawsuit that helped to bring about a charter change. It helped us to change from a commission form of government where the at-large elections, for all practical purposes, disenfranchised black Tulsans. So Reverend Roberts was successful in being part of that movement. We did change to the council form of government, and in the election for blacks to represent us at the city council, Reverend Roberts was one of the first black councilors. He and Dorothy DeWitty were seated. He represented District 1. Dorothy DeWitty represented District 3. And you see that parted here on the map. Tulsans were elated. All of our hard work and protest had finally borne fruit. We now had a representative from our districts. And at this desk, Reverend Roberts sat for 4 years.
4 years.
Okay. In ensuring that building projects came to our region. For the first time, we had massive improvements, Osage lighting, all kind of improvements came to North Tulsa because of his work, his insistence that equity be recognized right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Many people don't know it, Mrs. Gates, but the cultural building that they're breaking ground for right now, we was able, through the city, to get $1,300,000. That was the first money that was set aside for that building. We got it by twisting arm of Roger Randall, which he was a good person to twist his arm sometimes.
Yeah. Roger Randall, who helped with the civil rights movement when he was a TU student, later became mayor of Tulsa. And thank you, Reverend Roberts, for he is the father of the civil rights movement in Tulsa. Every time we try on an apparel of clothing in a store, sit down and eat, stay in any hotels, which we just take for granted today, we must remember it was not always taken for granted. It was people like Reverend Roberts who first challenged the inequity of segregation and who helped to bring about free and open public accommodations today. Thank you, Reverend Roberts.
A lot of our persons in this district, especially North Tulsa, especially, in a hurry. You cannot change the charter today and get everything you want tomorrow, because this is something that's been going on for 100 years. And if our people will continue to have a little patience and faith and keep the right person here that's going to get these things, I can assure you that this city is going to be a better city in years to come. I had 20 projects that was approved in the 4 years that I was here. And this thing was just like Virgin. It just began to move through how that's one of the first projects. And the culture centers I was mentioning. Osage Expressway, I'm going to have to maybe threaten a lawsuit there because I know $5 million was put into that area for Osage. They haven't done anything, and they can't do that when going from Apache to the Osage Hill. That was a project. We had 20 projects that was approved, and then with Brother Joe Williams becoming the council, and I know he has added something to it. We're going to have a lot of things added, and after a while you're going to see a lot of dirt being moved and a lot of changes being made in Tulsa if we have a little patience.
Good. We're now standing at City Hall looking over the buildings that the oil men built. To the left we see Williams Center, right there with the little dome in the middle, the NBT, the old First National Bank that the oil people built in the early 1900s. Later became NBT, National Bank of Tulsa. Then we see the old Mid-Continent building. The Mayo, we just see the sign on the Mayo. Bank 4 building, the old Tulsa County Courthouse. But this whole row in there, those are the major buildings of the oil men. Today, modern oil people live there, like Dewey Bartlett, have their offices there, LaFortune, and so forth. But in the old days, it was the Skelleys, the Sinclairs, the older oil makers, the Gettys, and so forth. Downtown apartment complex where many of the downtowners have their townhouses and their lovely apartments, and some of them walk to their offices and walk here after work. After school, public school segregation in the United States was declared unconstitutional in the famous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case in 1954, blacks began to emerge from the crippling effects of racism in the United States. And with the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, there was a full-fledged rebirth of pride in Africa. And we saw no longer were blacks content to have whites to confirm or clarify or determine who their heritage and heroes would be. It was now acceptable to revere Mother Africa. We began to see all kinds of things about Africa. They rejected the image that we were a slave people. They rejected the cotton sack and the cotton bowl as defining our culture and our history. So there was a total rejection of this and a reaffirming of the African heritage. It became popular to write books about Africa, about our heritage going back to ancient Egypt. The recipe books changed. We had American Indian cooking and African cooking acceptable. Teachers began to teach lessons. They used simple things like animals to teach lessons about the continents, about Africa. And people brought African furnishings from their homes, their tables and kitchens, and of course the fabric for the fashions. And we're wearing African outfits. The kente print was very, very popular. These earrings have the kente pattern. The hat, her outfit has the kente pattern. Even the men got on board. The African American men with the two-piece suits. That's the top. And even some of the brothers who were real sensitive and shy began to get on the bandwagon and wear the outfits with the little matching hats. And here are all kind of outfits from Africa. This is the full-length outfit worn by men in Ghana, which used to be called the Gold Coast and then the Slave Coast. But this is called the Buba, and this came from Ghana, was brought back from Ghana. These are beautiful prints of Africa. All the different fabrics, fashions. In the slave days, the slaves have been told, you know, their skin color was to be camouflage. They were not to be proud of it. They were to hide it and wear dark, somber colors. Well, now it was permissible to wear the bright colors of Africa. We learned there was nothing to be ashamed of about skin color. Well, long before it was acceptable to do this, long before we recognized our heritage and determined our heroes, there was one woman who was already doing that, and that was Maxine Johnson. She always was a rugged individual. She wore what she wanted to wear. She wore the afro hairstyles, and long before it was acceptable, and the cornrows, long before Bo Derek made the plaited hair popular. She was her own person. Maxine Johnson has been very active in the community, in the Tulsa community. She has been plaintiff in several landmark cases that brought about change in government at the city level. She was a plaintiff in an NAACP lawsuit against the city of Tulsa that brought about charter change. She was also a plaintiff in a famous judicial case that brought about a change in judges. And she's just, well, she's known as the plaintiff of the prairies because of her activities. That's her affectionate nickname. Maxine, let's just sit and talk. How did you become this political activist? What made you take on the city of Tulsa and the state in this other lawsuit? Have you always been this way?
No. Mrs. Rudersill, Freddie Martin Rudersill, did you know her?
Mm-hmm.
She was a librarian. That's who the library is named after. Had always said that I always read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
She always said I was antisocial and I should become involved in the community. So I did become involved, and I did get involved myself in the NAACP. And in 1980, I decided that I would run for president because I always felt that our younger people are not trained. We older people hang in these positions until we die. Then our younger people come along and they have had no training. They don't know nothing what's going on. So I ran on that platform. And I guess I was fortunate. I was there for 8 years until I decided, I needed to pass on the torch, because that's what that is. We had a torch, a job to do. Slaves have brought us out because they lost their lives. A lot of people lost their lives for us to be able to appreciate what we have now. Whatever. But anyway, your city commission members, every time people had a problem, they go to the city commission meeting. They would sit up and sleep. Commissioner Metcalf was famous for that. He was forever sleeping. People would be up pleading, just begging. And then they'd wake up and, they wouldn't even consider what they said. And it hasn't changed any, believe it or not. It's the same thing. And that was what made me decide. I talked with persons in the community. We had plenty of members, senior citizens, retired, would always do help with whatever it was we wanted done. And I talked to people in the community and they said, let's have at it. And so we filed through the national office. And with the help of everyone in the community, we were successful to a degree. Now we still have to educate our people in order to get someone in these positions who we all have a common goal and who can work together. And I don't see a lot of change.
What about that law, the judicial suit that you were part
Well,
of?
Mr. Robinson, Greg Robinson, filed that suit for the same reason. We have no district judges, one, I think, that all ones, and that was included also in our suit, what would help us to be successful in challenging the city of form of government, because statistics prove that there are no black judges for one. And the special judges, there's not many black special judges. I think Judge Harris is the only one who serves at the pleasure of the district judge. And if they wake up on the wrong side of the bed that morning and come in and say, we no longer need you, they're out of there. And we, Mr. Robinson, felt that that needed to be handled. And he filed a suit, and then we came in as intervening plaintiffs in order to help persons in Oklahoma City, and I think Pawnee County, different persons in Oklahoma, period. And that was successful. So, I mean, but the more things change, the more they remain the same, because you see the same attitude there at that city council meeting. I watched a group of people from 61st Street, black people, Mary Beard and whoever, 61st Street Club or something. They submitted a proposal. They told them that they hadn't done it correctly. So they went back and they did all of their researching and whatever, and the council persons helped them, supposedly. They turned around and gave it to a white organization. The 61st Street community group or whomever. Those people didn't even have to submit a proposal. They took that away from those people.
So you still see a lot of
The
inequity in the
same
city.
thing.
What can we do about it?
Well, we're going to have to educate our people. We're going to have to, I don't mean, see, we have plenty of meetings. People are tired of meetings. The reason we were so effective, I feel, in the NAACP is because we communicated with the people in the community. You know, we go to them. We didn't leave it up to you come to a meeting. We did it in the grocery stores. We did it in the churches when we meet people. Everyone has a constituency. And if your constituency can see that you are, I'll say, honest about what you're doing, and they see that when there is a result, it's because of an overall, you know, because my thing is, and we've read it numerous times, there's power in numbers. And we have to, the people are disillusioned. So we have to gain their trust again. And until we do that, we're not going to be able to make very much of headway. But I stay in the community, and I stay at people's houses, and I stay in the stores, and I'm saying all the time. So, you know, some things take place in their communities because they become a little bit more active about it. And, you know, they talk about North Tulsa and how big run down it is, but if you drive around and look at these homes, these people have begun to fix up their homes. It looks good out here. There's some nice houses out here on these streets. But until we stop letting people tell us how bad we're doing, and you know, we're not going to ever get any place.
Johnson still is not satisfied with Tulsa, but that's what we need. We need people who won't accept a halfway job. There has been change, like the charter change and the judicial change, but we still have a long way to go, and Maxine Johnson isn't content until we see full equality in Tulsa. And she mentioned working with youth. In addition to working in the community with youth, she tutors at home. She homeschools some of her grandchildren and some neighborhood children. She is active with the NAACP youth group, and she used to be active with the youth group. Now she's just concentrating on mentoring at home community. And she is not content. She will always be an activist until we have a true democracy. Thank you, Maxine, for sharing this with us.
You're welcome. I'll be dead by the time we get a true democracy, but we have to keep on pushing.
We're going to keep
We have to keep it up.
Yes. George Monroe is a Tulsan who grew up here, was born in Tulsa, raised in Tulsa, product of Tulsa schools. He has witnessed a lot of history. But like most people, when you're witnessing history, when you're a child, you don't know it's going to be history. But he is one of the few people that I have met in Tulsa who actually knew Simon Berry. And of course, as a child, he didn't pay much attention because he was a child. But he has given us some good information, some very good information about the Berry family, the Berry contributions, what's happening with Simon Berry's son, Simon Berry Jr. today. And also just his own life is fascinating. He had quite a few breakthroughs in Tulsa. And we're going to let him just tell us about it, about his life in Tulsa. Mr. Monroe, just kind of tell me what you told me before about growing up where you lived close to Mount Zion and some of the jobs you had
Well, I would start by saying I was born at 408 East Easton, and that's within the shadow of Mount Zion Baptist Church. In fact, there was just a walkway about 2.5 feet wide from my house to the walls of Mount Zion Baptist Church, and it was the one that was destroyed during the race riot. And Booker T. Washington, I've always lived across the street from Booker T. Washington. They used to kid me all the time by saying that I could wake up, if I were to wake up at 8:28, I could be in class by 8:30. They used to kid me about that all the time. But other than that, I lived at 410 East Easton Street, and later my dad built a house where the skating rink used to be at one time at the corner of Haskell and Elgin Place, which was Exeter at that time, E-X-E-T-E-R, Exeter Street. And I came up in Tulsa, had an orchestra at high school, went to Wiley University and played in the band there for 4 years. Came out and started working for the Coca-Cola Company. And I was the first black a salesman on the north side of the city. That was during my younger years, and if there's, I've had a number of jobs as a deputy sheriff, city sanitarian for the city of Tulsa with a district on the north side of the city. And my Army career took me all over Europe. I've got medals of all kinds for participating in the European theater. And that's came back to Tulsa, and here I am.
Okay. Tell me about Simon Berry. Oh, first about the race riot in your dad's rink. Would you tell me what that represents?
Yes. My dad owned a skating rink before the race riot, and at that time, he didn't trust banks too much. We had an old mailbox that every night he would stack his money up in dimes and quarters and nickels in this old mailbox. And during the race riot, it got so hot, and the houses burning down and everything else, all the monies that was in that mailbox stuck together. And I salvaged this dollar's worth of dimes there. And so those have been in the family a long time. That's since the race riot. So.
Okay. Now, back to Simon Berry. Tell me what you remember. You were a child, but what do you remember about Simon Berry?
I remember Mr. Berry as a man, he was an entrepreneur. He built a number of buildings. He had the Lincoln Park, what is now the Lacey Park. At one time it was Berry's Park. We remember him from that. We remember him on account of the buildings. The one building he built at the corner of Archer and Archer Street and Hartford, a building there. And then across the street from there, where the old Mabry's garage was where his headquarters for his bus line was. He had a bus line. I didn't witness this too much, but I always heard that he was enthusiast of planes. I don't know as to whether he flew planes, but I know he was connected heavily with airplanes. His son wound up being a pilot for the Flying Tigers. And if I'm not mistaken, if he hasn't retired, I think he's still flying for the Flying Tigers.
That's out of Los Angeles.
That's out of Los Angeles, out of Los Angeles. Mhm.
And tell me about the family relationship. Simon Berry Jr.'s wife.
Yes, I was living at 528 North Elgin Place, and Simon used to come around all the time. Well, I knew Simon because of his name, Simon Berry. And I found out that he was coming to see my wife's sister. And so we had a little talk, and I told Simon, I said, Simon, now, if you've got serious things in your mind, I don't want any playing around a little bit. I said, because I've got my eye on you. Yeah. But eventually, they married, and they both married. They've been married for nearly 40 years, around 40 years. And the little lady married was my wife's sister, Ella Pearl Simpson was her name. And that was his wife. They married from out of my house. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's Simon Berry Jr.
Simon Berry Jr. That's yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. You're one of the few people in Tulsa who remember Simon Berry. I have read about him and hear about him in books, but you actually knew the man. So
Yes. I was a kid, and it's. I don't know of many people that knew today that would know him as you would like for them to know him. But I was a youngster, and this is what I know about him.
thank you. Mr. Monroe has shared some valuable documents with us. Here is a picture of him with his first Coca-Cola route in the 1930s in Tulsa. He was the first black to break the race barrier in this business endeavor. A copy of this photo hangs at the Greenwood Cultural Center exhibit of Representative Don Ross, Greenwood from Ruins to Renaissance.
Okay.
Mr. Monroe, during World War II, when he was with the gasoline quartermaster supply squadron, and it was their job to supply the gasoline for the tanks all over Europe. And he saw action in England, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, just all over Europe, wherever gasoline was needed. And that was everywhere where there were battles. And this is Mr. Monroe as a Tulsa County Deputy Sheriff in the 1940s.
Under George Blaine.
He was under George Blaine. And this is a document showing how his father, his grandfather, David Monroe, received a homestead settlement, homestead allotment in Perry, Oklahoma, April 1927, and it is signed by President Theodore Roosevelt. This is the oldest document that Mr. Monroe shared with us. It is the deed to property, a homestead settlement in Perry, Oklahoma, that was granted to his grandfather, David Monroe, on April 27, 1903. And this was when it was Indian Territory, so the document is signed by President Theodore Roosevelt, right here. The signature of President Roosevelt right here on this line.
Maxine Johnson, longtime Tulsa resident and Greenwood historical expert, and she retired from teaching at Edison High School for how many years?
22 years in Edison, 2 years supervisor of social studies, kindergarten and 12 Tulsa Public.
So she's going to share with us her historical perspective on Greenwood.
Thank you. There's nothing I like better than talking about history, so let me give you a little warning. You're a captive audience, and there's nothing a teacher likes better. Now, we don't have a lot of time, but what I'm going to try to do is condense thousands and thousands of years of history into about a 20-minute presentation. And that's hard to do. I won't be like the guest speaker I heard about recently. He gave a talk, and he went on and on and on. He was a graduate of Yale University. He gave an hour's discussion on each letter of the alphabet. 1 hour on the Y, 1 hour on the A, 1 on the L, 1 on the E. And when he got through, somebody said, thank God he wasn't a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So I am not a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am a graduate of the University of North Dakota. So you're in trouble. No, really, I want to just kind of quickly share some information about this structure that we're in, which is Mount Zion Baptist Church, about these pictures on the wall, which is an exhibit called Greenwood, From Ruins to Renaissance, by Representative Don Ross. And some of the pictures in that exhibit were taken by photographer Don Thompson, who is working with me. We're joint producers of a documentary that we're working on right now called Black Settlers in Tulsa, The Search for the Promised Land. And so I'm just filled with information about this. I gave this tour last year to Leadership Tulsa, and I thought I knew history. I got a master's from TU in history, and I've taught it for 22 years, and I've traveled extensively as a military wife all over the U.S. I've been to 46 of the 48 contiguous states. I've lived in England 6.5 years, traveled all over Western Europe, went to the Middle East to study the Holocaust, and I thought I knew history. I didn't know anything until I started doing this documentary, talking to these little people in their 90s. It is fascinating. So I'm just bubbling over with history about Tulsa. So let me quickly try to condense it into about 20 minutes. First of all, to understand about Tulsans, about North Tulsa, about this particular little geographic region where blacks settled in Tulsa, you have to kind of understand a little bit about black people as a whole. In fact, you really need to know about America as a whole. And I used to do this with my students. I said, now you can't understand this unless you know. Picture that as a map of the U.S. Over here is New England, where the colonists came and they settled the first 13 states. And then there's the Ohio Valley. Then move on to the Midwest. And then you'll get to where Oklahoma plugs in. So just kind of imagine that whole map of the United States. All these different people that we call Americans. Fascinating people. It's like a patchwork quilt. And we all come from different continents, different races. The three major races, biologically, there are three. Caucasoid, people of light skin and long, thin hair. Negroid, the people with dark skin, short, kinky hair. And the Mongoloid, the Asian, that's the three biological races, with the jet black hair and slanted eyes. And it's real interesting that all those people are represented in this country, in this already incarcerated. And he brought them in, he had a 3-story house, and he brought them in and turned this whole bottom floor into a shelter for his women and children to stay in the life. So just not one head about that. And so we must never lump label and stereotype. Not all of the black people were good anchors. There were some, what we call underground elements. And most of them were bootleggers and numbers runners. And there's one man writing a book on that. Do you know A.D. Davis? His dad is one of the first black persons. He's writing a book about that. He's going to stress that our book is not. We're going to mention it because we want to recognize and try to be as realistic as possible. There were bootleggers and number runners. In fact, there was a famous ship out on Greenwood between the bootleggers and the police. Because they paid off the police who left them alone, and this time the policemen didn't honor their payover agreement, so they get in battle. And one of the bootleggers killed was the first husband of one of our common neighborhoods. So we've uncovered some really Mrs. Gardner told me that. She said when she was a little girl, every Sunday, she would go to church, and one of her Sunday rides, one of her favorite members is riding in this neighbor's 1920-something Model T Ford. They would go out and ride. Miss Darty said she would have on a pretty dress and a little hair and pigtails, and the man would have a little book for her to sit on so she wouldn't miss anything. And among their many stops was a visit to his steel. So, colorful characters. Oh, this is Thurgood Marshall, who our first Black Supreme Court judge came to Tulsa. That's Mr. Whitlow that he was with, and Amos Hall, a prominent attorney. They're working on strategy, and they were going to challenge University of Oklahoma for working to integrate higher education. And we're going to interview Judge Bryan because he has a fascinating story to tell. He's a Howard University trained attorney, and he said Thurgood Marshall visited his class and practiced on things, what he was going to say in Brown versus Moreau. We're waiting to Judge Bryan. Oh, it's fascinating. The one on the right. He's the first black Coca-Cola salesman in Tulsa. They didn't wait around for the 64 Civil Rights Act. Some people challenged Coca-Cola in 1939. And that's something we're finding out. Reverend Roberts said that yesterday. He said, this city is racist, and it has problems, but they don't want other people to know. And so if you go and challenge them, you can get things changed. He said, that's how they opened up the public accommodation. They didn't have to wait. So, you know, I'm 6'6", tall, 230 pounds. But he said, we went down, he said, now listen, if one of these little children gets hurt, you haven't seen a riot yet. Here was this sweet, gentle old minister telling the city of Israel, and they were so afraid one of those kids was going to get a bruise. They were the most protected children in the Tulsa, those in the civil rights protest. There were 10 hotels. I talked to Juanita Hopkins. Does anybody know Juanita Hopkins? Dwayne, do you know Juanita Hopkins? Yeah. That woman is a walking history book. Her mind is still trapped. She could just rattle off. We had 10 hotels, 6 drugstores, and she knows exactly where they were. We are, of course, you know about our legacy of music, jazz, and our jazz hall of fame. We have interviewed Ernie Fields, who is now 91. About music and heritage. We interviewed one last night who told us about Maxine Johnson. I call her the plaintiff of the prairies. That one has been in living in more lawsuits in this city. She loves it, but she's in the NAACP law. And she, long before laws were saying, okay, you're equal, and that's the history of the laws. So it would be the same. We do have a community where it looks pretty, it has a historical. We're standing in the beautiful edifice of First Church of Christ Scientists, 924 South Boulder in Tulsa. And this church, Christian Scientists have a long history of activity in Oklahoma since before Oklahoma became a state, when it was Indian Territory, when the first oil people came, the restaurateurs, the businessmen, and all the other settlers coming in. The Christian Science movement is headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. And so in Indian Territory, they held church meetings in buildings, usually the big oil buildings like the Mayo, until they started to build smaller edifices. And in 1938, they built this beautiful Greco-Roman facility, which is still very beautiful, in fact, valued at over $1 million. It's one of the finer churches on what is called Cathedral Road, because out here on Boulder there's so many churches, and we'll see them from the outside later, but this is called Cathedral Road. First Church of Christ Scientists here, First Christian across the street, and other churches on down. This is an example of the Greco-Roman style, where they combine both features of the Roman church and the Greek church. And to understand this, you need a little tiny lecture on history. When Constantine converted to Christianity, and we're not sure whether he did this out of deep religious conviction or political expediency, but whatever the reason, it was legal for Christians to congregate and worship. And so they needed large places for them to meet and worship, congregational worship. And so they had two major designs, the basilica plan, rectangular wide aisles, a place for the podium for the speaker, and then they had the other example, the basilica plan, the central plan. And this church is an example of that, a circular dome, vaulted ceilings. And in addition to that, this church also has Greek features, and you can see the Ionic columns on the inside, and then the bigger Ionic columns on the outside. This is the example of the fluted Ionic columns, the scrolls or shafts at the top. This is a close-up of the outside of the Ionic columns, and it's a row of these in the front of the church that faces Boulder. And there will be a better view of these from the far side of the street. The church was built in 1938, as I said earlier, and by 1949, the congregation decided that it was a beautiful structure, but it was so formal. It didn't have the warmth that they wanted. So they called in Dr. Ada M. Robinson, who was head of TU's art department at that time, and she had also done lots of work with churches. Boston Avenue Methodist Church is considered one of her masterpieces. So they brought Dr. Robinson out here to First Church of Christ Scientists, and they told her they wanted more warmth, and so she designed this ceiling with these little roses, and it brought the ceiling, it brought the building down closer to the people. It made them seem more connected. The building was not so aloof. And this church is on a touring guide. When tourists do a walking tour of Tulsa, this church is one that they visit because they love to see this beautiful work that Dr. Robinson did here. This is the main auditorium of First Church of Christ Scientists in Tulsa, and we're standing underneath the dome, which is the focal point of this auditorium, the central dome, which was called the pendentive, and his beautiful stained glass and so forth. Lots of technical details, which maybe an architecture class would love to explain. Here we have the central. We're in this central auditorium is typical of the large congregational worship type building in the Greek early Roman days and the Greek days. You have your central area and then your two aisles to the side of the central area where the congregation worshiped. The stained glass windows are simple but beautiful. Dr. Robinson had some problems in decorating this church because of the nature of the Christian Science church. It does not have a personal pastor. The lessons, the sermons are very structured and formal. In fact, any Christian Science church all over the world will be having the same lesson. a lesson prepared by another church in Boston. There's no personal pastor, but Christian Science do have a pastor. These two books are called their pastor, The Holy Bible and Science and Health for Keeping the Scriptures, which was written by Mary Baker Eddy. So Dr. Robinson knew that since this religion was structured and formal and had no charismatic personal preacher to carry the message, then the declaration would have to do that. They would have to be warm and inviting and spiritually uplifting. And so that is what she did. Once she understood the Christian Science movement and the nature of the pastor, she was able to design the lettering, the coloring, to bring out that kind of warmth that she felt was necessary to help get across the spiritual message of Christian Science. And she did it. This church is considered a masterpiece in Tulsa. And we'll look at some of the examples of lettering and coloring that she did. Since the Christian Science Church does not have a personal pastor and the congregation must listen attentively, Dr. Robinson thought the rostrum should be emphasized and it must be authoritative. And so she painted it a different color from the church proper. She used this rose color in the back to give visual direction to the desk. And she thought that rose color expressed warmth and confidence. And the other colors are delicately varied to give the atmosphere of unity. And around the background over that God is love was a simple motive. It's repeated in the dome. And she thought that motive, that repetition was an abstraction, meaning prayer, an upward petition, descending blessings. Any Christian Science church in the world will have on its walls statements, profound spiritual statements by their leader, Mary Baker Eddy. And this is an example of the selection. They are not always the same. Different churches choose different messages. Rose color is in the background of the citations, which were divinely inspired. And it was considered that the style of lettering should be fitting to the style of the church, large classical letters. And this is gold leaf. It illuminates and it's sensitive to changing light, and that is part of the beauty of In the window design, the motif is simple. It repeats the decoration in the dome, and that is a circle which encloses a cross, and it brings the window and dome together. The signification of the cross within the circle is that by the cross, overcoming of trials and tests of the world, we are enclosed by eternity, the circle of spiritual constancy. In this beautiful auditorium, we have simplicity but not monotony. We have beauty, dignity, crutches, but it is not the focal point of the church. The focal point is that statement above the rostrum, God is love. That rose-colored background, those beautiful gilt gold letters draw the attention of the worshiper to what is significant in this church, and that is to the spirituality of God. Major Clark was born in 1917 in Headland, Alabama. In those days, there were not many opportunities for young black males. In fact, he said that most of his jobs were mowing yards and picking cotton. He was a good cotton picker, could pick 200 or 300 pounds a day. But there was someone who was even better, and that was a man named Shorty who could pick 600 pounds a day and was going to teach Mr. Clark how to be a great cotton picker like him. But before that could happen, Major Clark joined the military, joined the Army, and that became his life's career. He rose in the ranks all the way to Lieutenant Colonel. He's a very busy man. He's now retired. He's writing a book. Was very busy getting ready for the 50th anniversary of World War II, but took time out from his busy schedule to be interviewed because he wanted historical accuracy in reporting about the role of blacks in the military. He's especially been active in trying to set the record straight about the Buffalo Soldiers. So we're delighted to have you, Mr. Clark. Tell us about the black man in the military and about some of your experiences.
It is difficult to realize today, after having had an African American as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that the military was not always this way. It was very much different when I joined in 1940. At that time, it was very difficult to become an officer because the military was reflecting the attitude primarily of the Southerners who were concerned that African Americans continued to be in a subordinate status. They wanted to maintain the status quo, so it was very difficult to become an officer. However, political pressure did cause the military to relent somewhat and to have a number of officers trained. The problem was that these officers were not permitted to command white troops or white officers. Therefore, they were forced to remain in the lower grades of second lieutenant and first lieutenant. This was also changed by political pressure when the Army was forced to activate some units with African American officers in all the grades. These were battalion level units which required a lieutenant colonel as the commanding officer. There were two of these units in the 92nd Division, the 597th and 600th Field Artillery Battalion. There were two other similar units in the division, though, that only had the traditional organization of white officers in all the key command and staff positions and black officers in support positions. A famous Tulsan, the late Brigadier General Roscoe Cartwright, was in one of these other battalions. He was promoted to first lieutenant in August 1944, and although he remained in that unit throughout the war, he was not promoted above that during World War II. In the two units that were organized in the non-traditional way with all African American officers, the two commanding officers were lieutenant colonels, and they were able to provide a sort of a protective environment where the officers in their units could get promoted up to the normal ranks, captain and major within the units. One other problem with the Army during World War II is that in order to maintain the status quo and to keep the African Americans in subordinate positions, the Army did not really want to use them in combat initially. And the war had gone on for almost 2 years before any of the African American units were committed. One of the reasons was that a unit which performed well in combat, coming back to the United States would get a lot of publicity about that, and the people in the South were not like successful soldiers who had been successful against a non-African American unit overseas to come back, particularly in the South. So even where the units did perform very well, they did not get the credit that they really deserved. The most outstanding unit in terms of not getting credit was the 92nd Division, which had the largest number of African Americans under one command of any unit in World War II. It had almost 13,000 enlisted men, all African American, had about 250 white officers, and about 550 African American officers. Despite having this large number of African American officers, except in these two battalions that I mentioned previously, these officers were not promoted above the grade of captain. All majors and above were white. These officers were all in subordinate positions. There were successes and non-successes by this division during World War II. But overall, it performed its mission and had a large number of decorations. A large number of men were wounded. Over 500 were killed. World War II is the only war so far where no medals of honor have been awarded. That is a reflection of the times during World War II. There is a committee now from Shaw University looking into that to see what the cause of no Medal of Honor being awarded during World War II. They should have a report out about the 1st of January. We're hopeful that two of the men in the 92nd, a gentleman by the name of Vernon Baker and another gentleman whose last name was Fox, we are hopeful that they may be recommended for the Medal of Honor. In the case of Fox, he was killed at the time of the action which caused him to be recommended for the Medal of Honor. He was in a position that was being attacked by German troops, and there were quite a number of them, and in order to eliminate these troops so that they would not overrun units to the rear, he called for artillery fire. When they checked the coordinates that he was asking to fire on, they said, well, that's your position. He said, well, there are more of them than there are of me, go ahead and fire. And they fired the concentration. It killed the German, but it also killed him. It took many years before he was even given a Distinguished Service Cross. Now we are trying to get a Medal of Honor for him because that was no doubt of that being a sacrificial act without regard to his own safety. The other gentleman is named Vernon Baker, and he is still alive, and we are hopeful that if his recommendation is approved, that we'll be able to see early in 1995 a ceremony at the White House where he will be awarded the Medal of Honor. The 92nd Division has a veterans organization, an association, and they, over the last several years, they have met on the anniversary of the activation of the division, which was in October 1942. They had a similar meeting this year, and also a ceremony at Arlington Cemetery, which was, I believe we saw on CNN 2 days ago. It's an active organization. They give scholarships and so forth to students, and it is active in other ways. I am a member of that organization, and I am very interested in all of the activities that they carry on. Among those activities, of course, is to try to permit us to let the young people today know that their grandfathers did some things in order to make it better for them to enjoy rights that we did not enjoy. Enlisted in the Army in 1940 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the 349th Field Artillery Regiment, which was the first such regiment allocated to the regular Army. I remained there for about 6 months and then was sent as a part of the cadre to organize the 46th Field Artillery Brigade at Camp Livingston, Louisiana. And there again, there were 3 regiments constituting the brigade, which made it the largest artillery organization that is African American during World War II. I remained there until I rose up to technical sergeant and stayed there until October 1942, rather to August 1942, and attended OCS. In October 1942, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery and was assigned to the 597th Field Artillery Battalion at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. After maneuvers in early 1944, political pressure caused the battalion to be organized from a traditional battalion with all white officers in command and staff position to a battalion with an African American in command. And that was our situation when we went overseas. We went overseas and landed on 6th of October 1944 at Leghorn, Italy, and went into combat shortly thereafter and remained in combat until the armistice was signed in Italy on 2nd of May 1945. We started preparing for a redeployment to the Pacific and was well along on that training when the first atomic bomb was dropped in Japan. After the second atomic bomb was dropped a couple of days later, things changed. We knew the war was winding down, and everybody began to prepare to return to the United States. In the case of a number of us, however, we realized, we had heard that when the African American officers returned to the United States, they were immediately discharged. And there were a number of us who wanted to remain in the Army. And therefore, we decided to remain in overseas a little longer than would have been required by the number of points we had. So I remained in Italy until about February 1946, and then transferred to Germany, where I remained until June of 46. I returned briefly to the United States for what they call rest and rehabilitation, and then I returned to Germany and stayed until May of 1947. I returned home for a brief leave, and I received my orders to report to Hampton Institute as an assistant PMS&T. I remained at Hampton Institute for 4 years until 1951.